What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be diving into some budget decks that I have come up with the launch of Dominaria United, as well as rotation as happened in Arena. It's definitely, a very interesting time. There's a lot of things up in the air at the moment, as we really don't know where the meta is going to shift overall as a whole, as there is some interesting stuff that has come out of just Dominaria United, as well as we still have those decks that were established in the prior meta that, with a couple, replacements and upgrades, they're kind of, making their way through the meta overall. It will take probably a few days, if not a week or so, to probably really see which way the meta is going to really develop. But in today's video, we're going to dive into some budget decks. I am going to start out with some monocolor budget decks just to kind of get an idea of, a decent place where to start. The reason why I went with monocolor is just because it's a lot easier to build, especially when you're on a budget. And with rotation happening, the worst part would be is that you wouldn't be able to play a certain deck because you don't have the lands. The benefit of playing a monocolor deck is really you can play basic lands and then slowly develop and get, the rare legendary lands if you really want to play those. With that out of the way, let's just dive into the decks and let's just start talking about them. So the first deck up is going to be a mono black budget deck that I've come up with. Mono black is definitely one of those decks. It definitely has a stay in place here in standard, as I do think there's a lot of powerful cards that you can build around when it comes to playing mono black. And I think this is a pretty decent shell to start out with, as it does play a lot of cards that were definitely good prior from the previous standard, as well as add in some of the newer cards to kind of make up the difference. But for the most part, it's a pretty sweet deck that will get the job done, especially when you're on a budget and you're wanting to build your way maybe to a fully fledged out mono black deck. But with that out of the way, let's just kind of go through the cards and kind of talk about them. So the first card up is a new card called Cut Down. It's a new spot removal spell. That's a 1-mana remove target creature spell with total power and toughness 5 or less. So, it can't hit anything that has a power and toughness that is greater than 5. So it can't hit a 3/3. Anything that's a 2/3 or a 3/2 is what this spell can hit. And the one thing that's good about this is that, the one problem I think that, a lot of decks have is especially against the more aggressive decks, is kind of removing those really early turn creatures. And a lot of the removal that we had available that was kind of cheap on the cheaper end was, multiple, 2 mana, if not more. And Cut Down is that instant speed spell that kind of maybe helps us out in that early game aggressive deck that may be trying to overrun us overall. Then we're moving over to Eaten Alive. This is a spell that I do think if you have some sort of way to sacrifice a creature, or if you have the mana available to pay the 5 mana, I think this is another great kind of removal spell in that sense, because it's a 1-mana removal spell that exiles target creature or planeswalker. And because Bloodchief Thirst has kind of left the format, Mono Black was kind of finding that, replacement card for Bloodchief Thirst. And I think this one's definitely pretty good, as this deck does play cards that we can sacrifice and get that benefit on, on the cheap if we want to. But in the late game, we can always pay that additional 4 mana and just do it without having to sacrifice anything. So I do have Eaten Alive here at 3 copies. Then we have Evolved Sleeper. This is that one card that I added that is new from Dominaria United. The one thing I will note as well is all the rares and mythics outside maybe the ones from Dominaria United are the ones that are within the starter decks. So, if you have all the dual color starter decks, you should have most of these cards already unlocked outside of the rares and mythics from Dominaria United. So Evolved Sleeper is one of the new cards. It is a 1-mana 1/1. This is a great card in the sense that you can pay mana and level it up, or evolve it, I should say. So 1 mana makes it a 2/2, 2 mana makes it a 3/3, and 3 mana gives it a +1/+1 counter, so it makes it a 4/4. And then every time you do this, you get to draw a card and lose 1 life on the last chapter. And you do have to go in succession. You can't just skip to chapter 3 immediately. But still, it's an overall very, very good 1-drop that I do think this is an area that if you're looking to develop your 1-drops, this is probably one of the cards I would focus on. Then we have Okiba, Reckoner Raid. This is a 1-mana enchantment that pings your opponent for 1 point of damage for the first 2 chapters. And on the 3rd chapter, it turns into a 2/2 vehicle that are 2/2 rat rogue that has menace and gives all your other vehicles menace. Though we don't play any other vehicles, it's still a decent card that kind of, slowly drains your opponent. Kind of like how, Kamano does for red, but this does it for 2 chapters. You gain a little bit of life out of it and then get a creature on the last chapter that has menace with it. That's definitely good. Then we're playing Persistent Specimen. I know this is not really a very big, surprising card. It's not really anything splashy. It's just another 1-mana creature. But I do like it as a creature that we can use, to play our spell like Eaten Alive or any other cards that would have some sort of ability that would make us sacrifice a creature in order to get some additional benefit. And then the benefit of it is, as well as you can always return it for 3 mana back to the battlefield tapped, which is definitely pretty sweet. Like I said, this is kind of like that sacrifice fodder. We did lose cards like Shambling Ghast and Eye Twitch, and Persistent Specimen is not those cards. You're not getting value when it leaves the battlefield, but the benefit is you can kind of cycle it over and over again if you want to kind of take benefit of it and kind of use this as that sacrifice fodder. Then we have March of Wretched Sorrow, just another spot removal spell in the deck that we can pay X mana and deal X damage to target creature and or planeswalker, and then we gain X life. And the added benefit here is that we can discard black cards from our hand and make it cost 2 less to cast for each card exiled this way, which is just another good way to kind of get this on the cheap. Definitely a good card, definitely something that I would play probably a couple more copies of as I upgrade the deck, as well as life gain could be definitely important if the meta is definitely very aggressive. Because we are playing mono black Infernal Grasp, I think it's still that best, 2-drop removal in the format. It's just two mana, destroy target creature, lose 2 life. If it's that added benefit there that we can destroy any creature only for 2 mana, instant speed, definitely good at the cost of 2 life. Then we move on to the Knight of the Shadow, 2 mana, 2/2 with Menace, that opponents can't gain life. So if you do get matched up against any decks that have some sort of life gain or life linking creatures, they're not going to be able to gain life as long as it's on the battlefield, which is definitely pretty sweet. And it does have a mana sync ability that we can pay 2 mana and give it +1/+1 to end a turn, which is definitely very good. And it also has Menace, so it's very good in the early game getting in for some damage because your opponent has to commit 2 blockers to it in order to really absorb that damage. Then next card up is going to be Tenacious Underdog. It's a 2 mana 3/2, has a blitz ability. They can pay 4 mana and pay 2 life. Enters battle. It comes in the battlefield. For its blitz ability, has haste. If you pay the 2 mana regular cost, it's just a 3/2. But the added benefit of playing blitz is that it gets immediately sacrificed, or when it dies, you get to draw a card, which is definitely very good. And this is kind of like that replayability, kind of get those final points at damage against your opponent. But yet again, another card that's definitely good for that aggressive style deck. This one's kind of built towards to be that more aggressive, try to keep the board clean, get those points of damage in, kind of drain your opponent kind of thing. So definitely a good card to add additional copies of. Next card up is going to be the Vengeful Strangler. It's a 2 mana 2/1 creature that can't block, that when it dies, you get to return to the battlefield, transform under our control, and attach it to target creature or planeswalker opponent controls. This is definitely not a bad card in the sense that, you enchant a creature or planeswalker and opponent controls. At the end of the upkeep, enchant a permanent controller, sacrifice a non-land permanent, then that player loses 1 life. So the interesting thing here is that if they have a card that, maybe they don't want to really sacrifice, you put this card on the flip side, and then they have to sacrifice other non-land permanents or actually force it on the turn that this triggers, sacrifice that creature. So definitely good there. And like I said, we have a couple creatures like the Specimen and this card as, ways we can use to sacrifice for the cost of other spells. Definitely a good card there. Meathook Massacre, it's a great board removal. Just 1 copy in the deck, but I would say as you kind of build up and kind of want to build a better version, I would say you probably want, at least 3 to 4 copies of this, as it is a great board removal spell for tap and X and 2 black mana. You'd give every creature on the battlefield -X/-X, and then whenever a creature we control would die, we would ping our opponent for 1 point of damage, and every time a creature our opponent controls dies, we gain a life. So definitely a good card overall. Then we have Fellstinger here as a 3 mana 3/2 with Death Touch and the exploit ability that we can sacrifice a creature to exploit. And then whenever it exploits a creature, we can target player, draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. So we can target us if our opponent's low on life. Maybe we can target them, drain them a little bit more, even though we do give them 2 cards. Maybe that's the way to finish them off. But overall, a good card, I think, for the deck, as we don't have a lot of ways to really draw cards. And this card, we get a 3/2, has Death Touch, and then also has a draw effect if we want to sacrifice something to it. Then we have Morbid Opportunist. It's kind of a card that gets benefit from us, sacrificing things or things just dying on the battlefield in general. It's a 3 mana 1/3 that whenever one or more other creatures would die, we get to draw a card and trigger only once each turn. So, if we kill something on our opponent's turn, we get to draw a card. If we kill something on our turn, we get to draw a card. Just a very good, effective way to, yet again, dig a little bit deeper into our deck. Definitely a good, solid 3-drop for that. And then in the 4-drop slot, we do have the Long Reach Knight, another interesting card here that is a 4 mana enchantment saga that, each opponent sacrifices a creature unless they discard a card. This happens twice, and on the 3rd chapter, we get the Aminus of Knight's Reach. It's a 0/4 with Menace, and then whenever it attacks, it gets +X/+0 and to end a turn, where X is the number of creature cards in defendant player's graveyard. So definitely a very interesting card here. I like sagas, especially in budget, because they do have extra value as you get, you get the initial cost, you get the 1st chapter, and then every other chapter after that, it's definitely beneficial to you. So definitely good there. And on top of that, if your opponent doesn't have any creatures, I believe for the 1st chapter, they can't sacrifice, so they automatically have to discard a card, which is definitely very good. So definitely not bad value at the 4-drop slot. And then I also have 1 She-Hold of the Apocalypse, a 4 mana 4/5 with Death Touch, and whenever we draw a card, we gain 2 life, and whenever opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. So yet again, another good card, definitely another new card that I think will make a very big impact in mono black. It is legendary, but I do think this is kind of one of those cards you want to make sure you hit in a mono black deck. So this is probably where you want to probably have almost 4 copies of it, if not 3. Definitely a good card there. And then we just play 24 lands, even though we are a low curve. Just 24 basics, nothing too crazy overall. Then going into the sideboard, this is kind of where I have those additional cards I would probably look to add into the deck if that we don't have already. Additional copies of Vault Sleeper, pretty straightforward. I probably just add additional copies of this, get rid of maybe your Persistent Specimens to add that, Tainted Adversaries, maybe get rid of your Vengeful Stranglers to add in your Tenacious Adversaries, Tenacious Underdog. You probably want to get rid of probably your Knight of the Death Shadow, just another, this is a much better 2-drop. We have more She-Holds. We probably want to get rid of our, enchantment that we have there. We have Invoke Despair, probably get rid of maybe some of our removal, as we're kind of heavy on the removal, and then also March of Wretched Sorrow. You can probably maybe trim down on like the Eaten Lives, add in some March of Wretched Sorrow. And then Meathook Massacre, same thing, maybe cut back on a little bit of the removal, add additional copies of Meathook Massacre. And then the other thing I forgot to add is the mono black legendary land. You probably want 1 or 2 of at most in the deck, just because you only have 1 on the battlefield as a mana source, and you can still discard it, mill yourself 3 cards, get back a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Kind of effect, which is definitely very good. But overall, I do think this is a good place to start out if you're looking to play some mono black, as it is kind of inexpensive. And like I said, most of the rares outside of the rares from the new set you should have in your collection, just because I believe all these rares and mythics all the rares were actually in the starter decks in one way or the other, as long as you have the dual starter decks unlocked. Next deck up is gonna be mono white budget. Technically it's mono white, it is mono white budget, even though I am playing the blue white land, as you can kind of see clearly. The reason why is just because I am playing Runic Shot as a card that has kicker. And I do think, having that ability to possibly kick it is definitely good, and therefore I included 3 copies of Idyllic Beachfront. But overall, this yet again, like the other decks, this deck is definitely very good. It is playing cards from, from the sets that would have been from the starter decks you would have already had. It's a mixture of creatures. There are some things that help us kind of benefit our creatures, just because the one thing is when you're on a budget, you're trying to be aggressive. And, the one thing that a lot of our creatures lack is that way to be super aggressive outside of the rare set mythics. So in the 1-drop slot, most of this here is a lot of stuff to kind of, help us out, get rid of things on the battlefield, or protect our creatures, or pump our creatures in general. So we have Boon of Safety here as a protection spell. You get to put a shield counter on target creature you control. You get to scry once, which fixes the top part of your library. We have 3 copies of that. We have Homestead Courage here as a 1-mana sorcery that we can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control, give it Vigilance to end a turn, and also flash it back and do it all over again. We got 1 copy of Hopeful Initiate. This is something where I probably would go up to 4 copies, just because when you fully fledge out this deck with a bunch of rares and mythics, this is definitely a good card you want to hit on turn 1, because if you follow this up with a good turn 2 and get an attack in, this will eventually start growing and growing. And also for 3 mana, you can remove 2 +1/+1 counters among creatures you control, and then we get to destroy target artifact or enchantment. Then we have Runic Shot here. This is a new card, definitely decent spot removal spell. It is kind of, one of those things situationally that your opponent has to tap down their creature in order to attack. You do have to probably take a hit. But the benefit here is for 1 mana, we can destroy target tap creature at sorcery speed. And if we have blue mana, we can kick it and scry 2, which is definitely good, as we can fix the top cards of our library, just because white doesn't really have any sort of way to really do that. So definitely good to have cards that will do things like that. We have March of Otherworldly Light, just a spot removal spell that we can, for X in a white, we can exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment mana value X or less, which is definitely very good. There's a lot of things in the format that you just want to get rid of and don't want to throw to the graveyard, because you don't want your opponent to replay it or get it back in some sort of way. So this is a good card there. And you can also exile cards from your hand to make it cost 2 less to cast if you want to get rid of it that way. We have Fleeting Spirit as a 2-drop, 2 mana 3/1. You can tap 1, exile 3 cards from a graveyard, give it for a strike at a turn. We can discard a card, we can flicker it off the battlefield and return it back at that end step, which is definitely very good in case there's some sort of board wipe effect, and whatnot. This is definitely a good way to get around like a Meathook Massacre effect, because it leaves the battlefield as that actually trigger happens. We also have Illuminator in the deck as a 2-drop, 1/1 that has double strike, and whenever it gets targeted by a spell we control, it connives, which allows us to draw a card and discard a card. If we discard a non-land permanent card, it gets a +1/+1. And the fact that this has double strike is definitely very good, so that's why we have a lot of spells that target creatures we control, because we can get triggers from the connive ability there. We have Knight of Dawn's Light, a 2 mana 2/2 with first strike. If we gain life, we gain that much life +1 instead, and then we can tap 2 and pump it +1/+1 to end a turn, which is definitely good. Spirit Companion, a 2-mana 1/1, allows us to draw a card. Definitely, it's just a card that helps us dig a little bit deeper, just because we are trying to keep that card advantage. The deeper we dig into our deck, the more answers we can possibly have against what our opponent's doing. And then we get a 1/1 creature out of it. We have Borrowed Time in the deck as as another way to spot removal spells, just because some of the more destroy target creature stuff is either kind of like situational, like Runic Shot, or it's rare and mythic. And this is definitely a decent thing to do. Borrowed Time allows us to exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield, which is definitely pretty good, as not many decks play a lot of things that destroy enchantments. Though I would say if you're playing like a black deck, they may have Invoke Despair. That's the only thing I can really think of that a lot of decks would probably run main deck wise, and there's not really anything outside of that people would probably be running. So Borrowed Time is a pretty good spot removal spell in that sense. We have Restoration of a Ganjo here. We can search our library for a Plains card, reveal a pit to our hand. Chapter 2, we can discard a card with mana value 2 or less, and then we can return target card with mana value 2 or less to the battlefield tapped. Which could be a land, it could be like a Spirit Companion or another creature. Definitely a good card there. We have Wedding Announcement, another good enchantment that creates 1/1 tokens. And then on the third time it triggers, we get to give all our creatures +1/+1. And also, if we attack with 2 or more creatures, as this is triggering through the steps, we get to also draw a card, though we don't get the token trigger out of it. But still, overall, a good way to kind of get some board presence on our opponent, kind of get wide on them pretty quickly. We have Adeline in the deck. This is kind of the card I increase copies of, so if you have extra copies, this is kind of where I would go with this style of deck, just because the goal with our deck is just kind of get wide, get Adeline kind of big, and then swing in, and it gets power equal to the amount of creatures we control, and then whenever we attack, we get to create a 1/1 tap human creature token that is tapped and attacking, and then we can attack them or the Planeswalker if they have one, which is definitely good, which also increases the power there. And then we have 1 copy of Wandering Spirit as a 4-mana flash speed Planeswalker. Definitely very good. We can +1 give target creature first strike if we need to at an instant speed. We can -1 and get a 2/2 Samurai creature token with Vigilance, or we can -2 and just exile target tap creature and gain 2 life in the process. And then we also have Elspeth Resplendent. This is yet again another good card, just because our deck is very low curve. We can +1. We can start putting +1/+1 counters on a creature we control, and then give it a flying token, first strike token, lifelink token, or Vigilance token, which is definitely good. So depending on the board state and where our life total is, we can kind of make that decision. -3, we can look at top 7 cards of our library. We may reveal a permanent card with mana value 3 or less, which is most of our deck. We get to put that card onto the battlefield and put the rest on the bottom of our library, though the card that we do put on the battlefield does come in with a shield counter on it, which is definitely very good. And if we get to the -7, we create 5 3/3 white angel creature tokens with flying. I would say the first 2 are very, very good, and then in a long shot, maybe the -7 is definitely playable if we do get there. But I would say we really want to take advantage of the +1 and the -3. And then we have 24 lands in the deck, just because we are a little bit higher, because of just kind of having a couple cards that are a little bit on the higher end mana wise. And then we are splashing blue, like I said, for the kick ability of the Runic Shot. Then in our sideboard, we have adding additional copies of Hopeful Initiate, probably trimming down on some of those pump spells, maybe those protection spells. Sun Gold Sentinel is one of those cards. This is a card that you could add. You don't have to add. It's a card that's a 3/2 for 2. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, we have to exile up to 1 card from a graveyard. So this is kind of one of those things that in my head, I'm wondering if people are going to be shifting towards playing decks that throw things in the graveyard or get benefits from things in the graveyard. This is a good way to eat things from that graveyard to kind of prevent them from getting that benefit. And then if you do have creatures of 3 different powers, you can tap 2 mana with the Covenant ability, choose a color, and then it gets hexproof from that color into end of turn, and it can't be blocked by creatures of that color. So essentially, it gets a pseudo protection kind of from that color until end of turn, which is definitely pretty good, and it only costs 2 mana. We have Thalia here, yet again another solid 2-drop, just a good way to kind of tax your opponent's spells. Because I do feel like if people are going to be playing a balance of creatures and also non-creature spells, and tax in their possible removal spells and other spells they're doing is always very good, and this is a good 2-drop to play. We have Anointed Peacekeeper, because we did lose Elite Spellbinder. Anointed Peacekeeper is definitely a good spell that kind of looks at our opponent's hand, kind of sees what's up, maybe tax maybe the worst offender out of their hand, and then every copy they would try to play does cost 2 more to cast. And then if it does have an activated ability that wasn't a mana ability, that also costs 2 more to cast, which is definitely pretty good. It's 3/3, has Vigilance, though the downside is if it does leave the battlefield, that tax goes away, so it's the only downside compared to Elite Spellbinder with this card. Brutal Cathar's, yet again another good card that would just kind of get rid of something from the battlefield until it leaves the battlefield, kind of thing. This is kind of one of those things that I would probably replace the borrowed times with, just because you get a creature out of the borrowed time effect, and it's definitely very good. And if it flips to the night side, you get a 3/3 for a striker. That does have the ward ability of paying 3 life. We have Sarah Paragon, another great card that I do think we'll see some play in white, just because if you have a low curve white deck like we do, its great benefit is that once per turn we can cast a spell with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard, or play a land, which is definitely sweet. Though the downside is if that spell would leave the battlefield again, it gets exiled, though we do get 2 life out of it. Definitely good overall. We have a Ganjo here, probably a couple copies in the deck, just because it'll add to our removal. Worst case scenario, we play it as land. Best case scenario, we have it as another spot removal spell. We have Guardian New Benella, just like Sun Gold Sentinel. You could also play this card in the deck. It's another good card, I would say, from Dominaria United, that has the enlist ability that whenever it attacks, we can enlist a creature, which means we get to tap a creature and give its power to this creature. And its secondary ability is that we can discard a card and give it indestructible, and then tap Guardian New Benella, which is also pretty sweet. We have Wandering Emperor, just adding additional copies. Probably just one more additional copy probably be good, just because what we want to do is kind of build up the bottom part of the deck, and then kind of have Wandering Emperor there to either help us finish off our opponent, or maybe kind of slow down whatever our opponent's trying to do with the minus abilities. And like I said, like Wandering Emperor, Elspeth Resplendent, it's probably just another one-off in the deck, just because we are trying to keep that curve kind of low. We don't want to play a ton of expensive spells. And like I said, the Planeswalkers, combine that with Sarah Paragon, are really where the top end of the deck would be. But overall, it's definitely a very interesting deck. I am in the process of making like actual versions of the upgraded deck, or at least an interpretation of my version of upgraded decks, but I still have a little bit more playtesting to do. But, nonetheless, if you're looking to play mono white budget, this is definitely not a bad place to start when it comes to that. Next deck up is going to be a mono green budget deck. This is another interesting deck that, it's one of those things that I do think it's a little bit lacking in the budget form of it, but this is definitely something that could work. It is a little bit slower. It is more of a mid-range deck than a typical aggro deck, as, we do lose a lot of key cards that really helps make, mono green pretty aggressive in the early game. But still, nonetheless, we do have a lot of cards that we can definitely take advantage of to hopefully overwhelm our opponent that way. We do play like 1-drop Fanga Shigeki here, a 1/1 Death Touch, or just, it's an overall decent card, just kind of put on the battlefield. It makes our opponent afraid to attack if they don't have some sort of way to remove it, as it does have Death Touch, which is definitely sweet there. We have Tail Swipe as a 1-mana fight spell. If we play it during our main phase, we give that creature +1/+1, then it fights, which is definitely pretty good. We have Tameo Safekeeping, because we do lose Snakeskin Veil. Tameo Safekeeping makes the deck, as it being a way to give target creature hexproof and indestructible to end a turn, and also gaining 2 life in the process, though we lose the +1/+1 counter effect out of the Snakeskin Veil. We also have Bite Down in the deck, just another way to kind of fight something. If we can ping a Shigeki, we can bite down a Fanga Shigeki and ping that 1-pointed Death Touch damage somewhere. That creature dies instantly, which is definitely very good. We have 1 copy of Gallic Readers. Just as a card that, grows as we play other creatures. We can also create mana if we want to ramp up, and we can gain some life out of it as well. We have Kappa Tech Wrecker. It's a 2-mana 1/3 that has the ninjutsu ability that enters battlefield, that has a Death Touch counter on it. And then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we may remove the Death Touch counter from it and exile target artifact or enchantment that player controls. So it has kind of like that way to get rid of enchantments. And, the one thing that is pretty good is that you can kind of team this up with Fanga Shigeki, because you may attack it with a Fanga Shigeki. They may not want to block. You ninjutsu out the Kappa Tech Wrecker and then destroy maybe their artifact and or enchantment during, combat, because they've already declared no blockers, and then you get the free trigger from that. We have 1 copy of Landlord Loam Speaker as a 2-mana 1/3 mana ramper with the tap, add 1 mana of any color. We also have the ability to tap target land we control becomes a 3/3 elemental creature with haste at the end of turn. It's still land and activate only as a sorcery, which is definitely very good. I do think, without the creature lands, green's kind of lacking that way to kind of finish off our opponent, and this is definitely a good way to do so, because it turns our lands into creatures, which is definitely pretty good. We also have Outland Liberator, just another way to kind of sacrifice it, destroy target artifact or enchantment, and it does have the Nightbound, Daybound cycle, so if we get to the nighttime side, we can also do the same thing for 1 mana, sacrifice it, destroy target artifact or enchantment. Also, on the Nightbound side, whenever it attacks, it destroys target artifact or enchantment defending player controls, which is definitely very good as well. We have Quarian Beast Caller. This card's definitely going to be a very dominant card, I think, in a mono green deck when you upgrade it. It being a 2-mana 2/2 that whenever we cast a creature spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then whenever it dies, we have to distribute X +1/+1 counters among any number of creatures we control, where X is the number of +1/+1 counters on Quarian Beast Caller, which sets us up to be a pretty good card. We have Roar and Earth in the deck as an interesting card. You know, it's a 2-mana enchantment that whenever land enters the battlefield under our control, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or vehicle we control. Just kind of a way to kind of, you know, pump something up, you know, over the course of time. If we play it early, every other card we play out afterwards and then play a land, we get to pump that card up. And then on top of that, we can also tap 2 and X. Discard it, and then we get to put X +1/+1 counters to target land we control, and it becomes a 0/0 spirit creature token with haste and still land. So just another way to kind of, you know, use this spell effectively depending on the board state and what's going on. We are playing Jewel Thief as a very solid 3-drop slot, especially for budget, as it's a 3-mana 3/3 that has Vigilance and Trample. Then when it enters the battlefield, we get a treasure token. So in theory, this card helps us ramp up. You know, maybe if we play this on turn 3, we then get to maybe skip to turn 5, which is definitely very good. Overall, very, very solid card for it being a 3-mana 3/3 Vigilance Trampler. Threats Undetected is another new card. It's a 3-mana spell that we can search our library for up to 4 creature cards with different powers, reveal them, an opponent chooses 2 of those cards, shuffle the chosen cards into the library and the rest into our hand. So this is kind of like a way to kind of maybe, you know, catch our opponent off guard, make them make choices with piles, and maybe help us find answers to what they're doing. In the 5-drop slot, we have 1 Defiler of Vigor, just another new card in the deck that for 5 mana, it's a 6/6 Trampler. As additional cost to cast a green permanent spell, you may pay 2 life. Those spells cost green less to cast if we paid life this way. And then on top of that, whenever we cast a green permanent spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it for each creature we control, which is definitely a very solid ability. And the one thing I kind of now know after playing this a couple times and play testing is that you only technically can do it once. So it turns any 1 green mana in that spell's casting cost into a Phyrexian mana, so you can pay 2 life once, which is kind of a little bit different than what I thought it initially read. So just as a little heads up with this one, but still overall it's still a strong card with the fact that it's gonna, you know, every creature that comes out afterwards is gonna pump whatever team we have out on the battlefield in general. We have Line Breaker Baloth as another 5-drop in the deck. It's a 5-mana 4/5 that has a list ability that we can tap a creature, you know, as this is attacking and give the power to this creature, and then this creature can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, so your opponent can't just chump block a 1/1 or a 2/2 in front of it. They have to commit something a little bit bigger to it, which is definitely not bad in a budget sense. In the 7-drop slot, we skip from 5 to 7. We go to Mossbeard Ancient as a 7-drop 7/7 trample, and just battlefield we gain 5 life. You know, it's an okay card, more of a limited card, but you know, when you're kind of limited on what like rares and mythics you put in, it's not a bad card to use temporarily until you get other big creatures in the deck overall. And then we have 1 copy of Titan of Industry in the deck as being a 7-mana 7/7 for each trample. And whenever it enters the battlefield, we can choose 2 abilities: destroy target artifact or enchantment, gain 5 life, create a 4/4 soldier rhino creature token, and also get to put a shield counter on target creature we control. So this is kind of like that big top end card of the deck, and it's kind of like another way where you probably replace some of your Mossbeard Ancients and add additional copies of Titan of Industry, just because that will help us out overall. And then mana base is 24 green forests. You know, nothing super crazy because we are a monocolor deck. We don't need anything super crazy, at least at the start, until we want to upgrade into the legendary land if we want to add that to the deck. And then in the sideboard, we just have, you know, other cards to look out for if you are playing green. Ascended Pack Leader is another good 1-drop. Probably replace Fengus Shigeki with this. Llanowar Loam Speaker is probably just another card that you could probably cut down on, like your Capitech Wrecker and or your Outland Liberator. Add this card instead, just because it's a good way to kind of ramp up a little bit quicker. Same thing with Quarian Beast Collar. Cut back on the Outland Protector and or your Outland Liberator and add more of these. You have Unlovable Oddity. Probably cut back on your Ballast. Add some of those. Defiler Vigor, maybe cut back on 1 ballot, add 1 more of these. Titan of Industry, get rid of the 7-drop, add that. Boseu, cut back on some of the forests, add a couple of copies of this. Probably 2 is more than enough, just because like all the other legendary lands, you can only have 1 out in the battlefield as a land, and the rest have to be used for their ability. Tracker is not a bad one to look out for if you want to maybe mess around with that instead of playing like Jewel Thief, as it creates a clue token, and every token we have out on the battlefield gives a +2/+0, so it becomes a 4/3 with Vigilance. Prowler is another good one to look at in the 3-drop slot if you want to replace Jewel Thief with that. As it enters the battlefield or attacks, we get the exile card from graveyard. It makes spells of that card type cost 1 less to cast, which is definitely good. Additional copies of Threat Undetected. Probably want to, you know, replace some of the non-creature spells in the deck, like maybe like the Roar and Earth with this, so we can kind of dig, once we start filling out the deck with other more threatening spells and really make our opponent make tough choices. This is kind of a good card for that. Invoke the Ancients, same thing. Probably cut back on some of the 5-drops, add this. You know, I'm unsure of where the meta is, but Silverback Elders definitely something to look at, because whenever we cast a creature spell after this is out on the battlefield, we get one of the 3 abilities. And it's a 5/7, which is definitely good. And then Unnatural Growth, yet again, you know, being a monocolor deck, this could be something that could make even like the most budget-friendly decks that much more aggressive because at the beginning of each combat, you double the power and toughness of each creature we control until end of turn. And turning like the smallest creature into a creature that's double its power and toughness could be very daunting for your opponent. And it doesn't happen just on our turn; it happens on both our turn and their turn. So definitely good there as well. But here is kind of like where to start if you're looking to maybe play some mono green. And like all the other ones, most of these rares and mythics outside the ones from Dominaria are from the starter deck. So if you have the dual color starter decks, you should have these rares and mythics. Moving on to the next deck, you're diving into Mono Red Budget. Mono Red Budget is definitely a good deck. I do think there's a lot of cards that even in a fully, filled out form doesn't really, cost a ton of cards to really invest into. This is definitely a very interesting deck. There are a lot of good things with it. There are some things I kind of threw in here just to experiment with and kind of see how they do. Talking about the 1-drop slot, we have Ancestral Anger in here as a way to, for 1 mana, we get target creature trample and gives it plus X plus 0, where X is 1 is X is 1 plus the number of cards named this in our graveyard, and then we get the draw card, which is definitely good. We have Hammer Hand as another good way to be aggressive. Enters the battlefield, target creature can't block this turn, and give enchanted creature +1/+1 in haste. We have Kamano in here because I think this is a card that most decks that are on the aggro side that do play red are going to play Kamano. Just because the ping 1's okay, the chapter 2 is really, really good, especially if you get this out on turn 1, followed up with a good turn 2 play. And then chapter 3 is definitely very solid because you get a 2/2 haster that immediately attacks, and whenever a source you control will do damage to that creature would die, you get to exile instead. Definitely overall good saga there. We added a couple copies of Phoenix Chick in here just as another good way to be aggressive on turn 1 and a 1 mana 1/1 fly and haster that can't block. And if we are able to attack with 3 or more creatures, we can pay 2. If we do, we get to return to the graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attack him with additional +1/+1 counter. Definitely a pretty sweet card in that sense, as is a way that, even maybe when the board gets wiped, we have other ways of getting that aggressiveness out on the battlefield. The other thing with this deck is we have a lot of ways to spot removal things. We have Play with Fire here as a, 1 mana, deal 2 damage to any target. And if it was dealt to an opponent, we have to scry, which is definitely very good. We have Rabbit Batteries in here. Just as a 1 mana 1/1, and then if we equip it or reconfigure it to a creature, equipped creature gets +1/+1 and also has haste. We have 1 copy of Shivian Devastator. This is kind of like one of those things that you top deck or play in the late game as you have a ton of mana. It's definitely very, very good. I'm very unsure about this card in general. It's like one of those things that feels awkward in the early game. It's really more of that kind of finisher or maybe after a post board wipe type thing when the board's pretty clean. It's just a very solid card as being X red mana, though it is, like I said, when you're playing on curve, you're not going to want to play it on turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. You probably want to wait until you have 5 or 6 mana out, so at least it comes out as a pretty decent sized creature, and then be able to attack it immediately with it. Then like the king of this deck that kind of makes this deck kind of be budget friendly is Electrostatic Infantry. This card's really, really good. If our opponent doesn't really get rid of it immediately, we can grow this card pretty quickly, as it is a 2 mana 1/2 with trample. But whenever we cast an instant and or a sorcery, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So you can play this, you can follow it up with a Play with Fire or other instant speed spell and immediately grow it, so then it becomes a 2/3. Or you can be reactive and wait till your opponent maybe does something. Maybe they try to ping it for 2 points of damage, and all of a sudden you Play with Fire on something, and all of a sudden it grows that additional +1 counter. Definitely a very, very solid card. And we are also playing Kami's Flare because of the ways that we can modify creatures. I think Kami's Flare makes a very good spot in this deck as being a way to deal 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. And if we have a modified creature, we get to do 2 damage to that permanent's controller as well, which is definitely pretty sweet. We have Lightning Strike as being a 2 mana, deal 3 damage to any target. Definitely a card you're going to see a ton of. We also have Twinferno, which is another very interesting card here. If we want to be super aggressive, we can, for 2 mana, we can give target creature we control double strike on the end of turn. If we want to be kind of make a cheeky play, we can play this, which gets a trigger like with Electrostatic Infantry. We can then, play like a removal spell or burn to the face. So you maybe follow this up with like a Lightning Strike or a Play with Fire. Then all of a sudden we're doing 4 points of damage or 6 points of damage to our opponent's face, and then this gets we get 2 more additional copies because Lightning Strikes would copy, and therefore 2 more spells were cast. Therefore, giving this 2 additional +1/+1 counters and then swinging in with a pretty big attack is definitely pretty good. So overall, very, very good card. It's not one you want to play a ton of copies of because by itself it's kind of awkward. If you don't have creatures out, you're not going to really be able to use this whatsoever. But still, what a overall good card. Reckless Stormseeker makes the deck because it turns on a lot of our cards, because of us being able to give target creature +1/+0 with haste and end of turn on the daybound side. Immediately turns a card that doesn't normally have haste, immediately be able to attack and give it that 1 additional power, even itself. On the Nightbound side, we get to do the same effect, though it gives target creature +2/+0 and trample and haste and end of turn, and it becomes a 3/4, which is definitely sweet. We have 1 copy of Squee, Dubious Monarch, just being a 3-mana 2/2 that whenever it attacks, we get to create a 1/1 Goblin creature token that's also tapped and attacking. And then we can cast Squee from our graveyard by paying 4 mana and exiling 4 other cards from the graveyard rather than paying its mana cost. So definitely another good ability here. So if there's like a board wipe, you can flashback Squee from the graveyard, because us losing some sort of creature lands, this is kind of like our way to be aggressive without having, to have that creature land, which is definitely good there. And then I have 2 copies of Thunder and Raiju as being like the top end of the deck, being probably something you probably want 4 of eventually. This is another good way to help modify the deck overall, because it distributes +1/+1 counters whenever it attacks, and then it deals damage based on how many +1/+1 counters on each other creature other than itself, and deals it to that opponent's face. And it is a 4-mana 3/3 that could be a 4-mana 4/4 depending on how you distribute the counters. And then because we are very low curve, we only are playing 22 lands, which is definitely not bad. Like I said, this deck is definitely very aggressive. We're really trying to finish our opponent off really quick, maybe get to like turn 4, turn 5, but still not bad of a deck in general. Then looking at the sideboard, we have some other cards you can consider as you want to upgrade the deck, but there's the Adversary is definitely very good. This is definitely a very, very tricky one. I'd probably get rid of Rabbit Batteries for it, as this is a card that is a 2-mana 2/2 haster if we wanted to just be that. In the late game, if we have 5 mana, we can pay 5 mana into it, and then be able to recast an instant or sorcery card from our graveyard with mana value 3 or less without paying its mana cost, which is definitely very good. Chandra is also very interesting here, as it has a +1 ability of being able to add a red mana to our mana pool and deal 1 damage up to 1 target player or planeswalker. We can +1 exile top 2 cards of our library. If it's red, we may cast it this turn. And if we get to the -7, we exile top 5 cards of our library. We may cast red spells among them this turn. You get an emblem with whenever you cast a red spell, this emblem deals X damage to any target, where X is the amount of mana that was spent to cast a spell. Overall, she's not bad to have a couple copies of, maybe like 2 of, just to kind of get that little additional mana ramp and or that 1 point of damage, which is definitely bad. And also her ability to dig deeper into the deck is also very good. Adding additional copies of Reckless Stormseeker will make that pretty consistent. It's definitely kind of tough. Because I don't know if Squee will really make the deck in general when you kind of like really fill it out with rares and mythics, but you could probably cut Squee out of the deck if you really wanted to, and then maybe cut down on, not really sure, to really fill out the rest. Thunder Raiju, kind of same thing. We have to kind of cut down probably somewhere in the 1-drop slot to kind of fit in Thunder Raiju, maybe go up to 4 copies. Shivian Devastator is probably, you get rid of Phoenix Chick, I would say, is probably the best place to add additional copies of this. And then Sokuzan, you probably just kind of cut down 2 mountains, add in 2 of these, as this is not a bad spell, as it allows us to create 2 1/1 spirit creature tokens that have haste at end of turn, and it costs 1 less to cast for each legendary creature control. But overall, this is definitely a good place to start out with mono red. If you're looking to try something out in general that has a decent balance of burn and creature damage, so definitely a good deck overall. And the last deck up is probably my favorite, just because I do like tempo style decks, and this is like my mono blue budget style deck, which is more of a tempo deck. It is a Delver deck. I feel like I've made probably a handful of Delver decks in like the past 6 weeks or so. It's definitely a very solid deck. It is playing tempo. We're not playing we're playing aggro tempo is the best way to put it, as we are trying to play spells. We're trying to attack in with little points of damage and look for opportunities to get in big swings of damage, but also leaving enough mana open to protect in general. And this deck has ways for us to take card advantage in overall, and kind of keep the cards flowing into our hand and be able to have answers to what our opponent's doing. The first card up is a new card from Dominaria. It is Combat Research. This is a card that enchants a creature we control. Whenever this enchanted creature deals damage to a player, we get to draw a card, and as long as the enchanted creature is legendary, it gets +1/+1 and has ward. That secondary ability is not, very effective in our deck, because I don't think we actually have a legendary creature, but, the idea here is a 1-mana aura that gives a creature we control the ability to help us draw cards is definitely very good there. And we have a lot of cards that have some sort of way to be evasive in general, because a lot of our creatures have flying, so putting this on a flyer where maybe our opponents have some sort of way to block it is definitely very good and helps us keep that card advantage going. Consider we have 2 copies of this, just a way to look at the top card of our library. You can put that card into our graveyard and then draw a card. Delver is just another good way to get that aggressive, 1-drop. We play as a 1-drop. If we are able to flip it on turn 2, it's awesome, because now we're swinging it for 3 damage. And it's definitely overall good card in general when it comes to that. We have Fate and Hope. Just another way, a couple copies of this to return target creature to its owner's hand. If its mana value is 3 or less, we get to scry 1. Yet again, kind of slowing down our opponent, kind of preventing them from really getting their momentum going. We have Shore Up here as a 1-mana. Target creature control gets +1/+1, gains hexproof at the end of turn. Untap it. Just another way to kind of, if they play a spot removal spell, a good way to kind of protect that creature and or maybe catch our opponent off guard and maybe block with a creature. Because that creature may be tapped, we get to untap it and also give it hexproof in the process. We have Slip Out the Back to get out of ways of if our opponent's playing some sort of board wipe. Another spot removal spell, and then phases out, comes back at the end of turn, and then has an additional +1/+1 counter on it. We have Haunted Figment, a 2-mana 2/1 with Vigilance that whenever it can't be blocked as long as we cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn. So definitely a decent 2-mana 2/1 Vigilant attacker that we can get in for some points of damage. Another way that we can kind of target one of our auras too to kind of pump it up in general. We have 1 copy of Ledger Shredder in the deck as a good way to kind of pump up and dig a little bit deeper into the deck, as it has a natural connive ability on it. So whenever a player casts a second spell during their turn or a turn, we get to connive with Ledger Shredder by drawing a card, discarding a card. If we discard a non-land card, we give it a +1/+1 counter. And that counts as both players, so not just us. It's all counts our opponent. Same thing on their turn. If we cast 2 spells on their turn, they cast 2 spells on their turn. We get 2 connive triggers, which is definitely very good. And being a 2-mana 1/3 is pretty strong in general. We have a couple copies of Make It Disappear, just trying to slow down our opponent. What they're trying to do on the early turns. We could sacrifice, make 2 copies of this and make them pay 4 for that spell, or in the early turns, kind of like just kind of like a typical counter, just kind of slowing them down. And while they don't have a lot of mana out in the battlefield, and they may be tapping down in general. We have Security Bypass, another aura that we can attach to a creature. If we attack with only 1 creature, that creature now becomes unblockable, and then whenever this creature deals damage to another player, we get to connive, which kind of like Ledger Shredder, we get to draw a card, discard a card. If we discard a non-land permanent card, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. We play Storm Chaser Drake as a card that if we get target with a spell we control, we get to draw a card. It also has flying, which is definitely very good. We have Essence Capture, a 2-mana counter target creature spell. We get to put a +1/+1 counter up to 1 target creature we control, which is definitely sweet. We have Haughty Jin. We are playing a bunch of creatures and non-creature spells, and this gets a power equal to the amount of instants and sorcery cards in our graveyard. Also has flying, definitely a very solid 3-drop. And then we also have 4 copies of Tolarian Terror, a 7-drop 5/5. It does cost 1 less to cast for each instant or sorcery spell in our graveyard, and also has Ward 2, which is definitely very good as being like the top end card of the deck. And just like all the other decks, this is a very low curve deck. We're only playing 22 lands, as we're typically not going to cast this for its full cost. We'll probably cast it for like maybe 3 or 4, and you really don't need to play a ton of lands to really get this deck going. So definitely good overall. When it comes to what we could add to the deck to make it better, just add in additional copies of Ledger Shredder is going to be good. Probably cutting down on some of the other creatures in the deck. If we want to get rid of the Haunted Figments, that's a good place to start. Same with the Haughty Jins. You cut down maybe on the additional copies of the Haunted Figures. Maybe you cut down on like the auras. Maybe we don't need 4 combat research, 2 security bypasses. That's probably another area to look at. We have March of Swirling Mist. Maybe this is where you cut back on like Fading Hopes, or maybe you want to take out a Slip Out the Back, maybe 1 Shore Up depending on how it goes, and add in a couple copies of this. And then we have Otawara Sorin City, cut down on 2 islands, probably adding 2 copies of Otawara. But overall, yet again, another great place to start if you're looking to play some mono blue. Each of these decks in today's video will be in the description below. I think they're all pretty decent places to start, each having their own unique strategy overall. And these are definitely something that I'll probably be adjusting as we get more and more understanding of how the meta is going to shift. It probably won't happen immediately, but probably as the course of Standard gets developed, as we kind of see where the meta overall goes, we'll kind of see where these decks' weaknesses and strengths are based on that meta, and I'll make my adjustments that way. With that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. Let me know you like these style of videos. If you're new here, you want to know when I post new videos on the channel, like this one, hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.